So let's start going through this acronym for success, which again is 10 pillars of what I consider podcasting success and content marketing success in general. Number one is start. It's a simple word, but so many people never get there. I went around the room earlier today, right before we started here. I introduced myself to a number of people, and a lot of the answers that I got are answers that I get very consistently. I actually just keynoted at Podcast Movement last month in Fort Worth, Texas. I actually was on stage right before they introduced Mark Maron, who had just a couple months prior interviewed the president. So it was a really cool scene. There was 1,100 people in the room at my talk. It was the opening keynote. It was amazing, and I spent so much time going around that room like I did today, and so consistently the answers that I got then and now, and that was a podcasting conference. And even today, it was, John, like, I don't have a podcast yet, but I'm thinking about starting one. And unfortunately, if I came back here a year from today, I would likely get even the same people saying the same answers. You just have to start. Because there's a quote that I love: if you want to be, do. If you want to be, do. Back in 2012, when I had ideas to start a podcast, but I had no podcasting experience, I had no broadcasting experience, I had never interviewed anybody before, I could have just said I want to be a podcaster, but I just had to podcast. If I wanted to be a podcaster, I had to podcast. It was really that simple. So you have to start doing that thing. And you can substitute that word for whatever it might be. LeBron James, you better believe that he didn't just step out to the free throw line and start knocking down free throws in Game 7. Like, he practiced. He did that thing. Tiger Woods, he didn't make his first putt or his last 10, but, he had to start somewhere. He had to start. If he wanted to be, he had to actually do that thing. So that first principle and that first pillar of success is start. This next one is absolutely critical. And if you can't already tell from just the entire presentation, which is based off of the acronym for success, like, I love acronyms. I use them in my podcast all the time. I'm using them throughout this presentation. UVD. If you are going to be a content producer, but specifically a podcaster, you need to be unique. You need to know what your unique value distinguisher is. If you don't hit these three words, your podcast is not going to rise to the top. And let me give you an example of what a unique value distinguishing podcast looks like. Entrepreneur on Fire was unique from day one. Because even though I had no broadcasting skills, no online presence whatsoever, I was unique. Because I was the only 7-day-a-week podcast that was interviewing inspiring entrepreneurs. The only one that made me unique. What was the value that I was giving from my podcast? Well, I can tell you, the value was not coming from me. Because I had no value to give. It was my first stab at the world of entrepreneurship. I didn't know anything that I was talking about. I was clueless on every single level, but the nature of my show was an interview podcast where I reached out to today's most successful and inspiring entrepreneurs and brought them on my show, and guess what? They had value to give. So my show was valuable from day one, not because of me, but because of the guests that I brought on. So there's many ways to provide value. It doesn't always have to come from you. And then what was the distinguisher for me? Well, I knew, being a podcast listener for years before launching my own podcast, that I had minimum time to listen to podcasts as I commuted to my office job at John Hancock in Boston. Like, I had a specific amount of time during my commute that I could listen to a podcast, hopefully gain some knowledge, and then go sit in my cubicle for 9 hours at a job that I didn't like. So that 35-minute commute, I had to be getting value from that podcast. And unfortunately, the podcast that I listened to, which came out once or twice a week interviewing entrepreneurs, which I loved, sometimes they talked about this, and sometimes they talked about that, and sometimes they talked about their weekend, and sometimes they talked about cats. And before I knew it, I was at work, and I was like, this specific podcast episode didn't really help me. So I knew from day one mine was going to be different. I was going to distinguish myself by creating a show that had the same format every day. Now, a lot of people say, John, people are going to hate that it's the same format. Well, I can tell you, 1,100 episodes later, over 1 million listens per month, over 22 million listens total, thank you, Leslie, my biggest fan in the front row right here. Over 22 million listens total. I mean, people dig format. And those that don't, there's other shows to listen to, and that's fine. You shouldn't be making a podcast for everybody. So my show starts off every single episode with, tell me your worst entrepreneurial moments. Take us there. I want my listeners to know that it's okay to fail. So every single episode of Entrepreneur on Fire starts with the worst entrepreneurial moment story. Then we talk about the lessons learned from that failure, and we move into their aha moments and the lessons they learned from that aha moments. Then I enter a lightning round of questions, which are very specific. So that distinguished my podcast from day one. So it was unique, it brought value, and it distinguished myself from the rest. So as you're creating the idea for your show, or if you currently have a show and you're looking to change things up because they might not be working, apply this and make sure that you're fitting these descriptors.